What I'm going to be doing for you at this point is sharing my screen so that you can see the presentation. And I'm just going to lay out my thesis for the causes of the Civil War for you here very, very directly. Now, there are, if you were to ask the question, what causes the Civil War, what causes Civil War, the vast majority of people would probably mention what one word?
Slavery.
Slavery. Slavery is typically the major piece in most historians' understanding of the causes of the American Civil War. However, that's not the only possible answer. There are other possible answers that tend to come out of like kind of Southern mentalities, like a blundering generation was the cause of the war and this sort of thing. And we'll get to those sort of thoughts later. But if slavery was the cause of the Civil War, usually the root of the issue is found in one of three places, right? So slavery is the cause of the Civil War, but in what way? Remember when we read Davis and Woodman? Davis and Woodman suggested that there were there were two main questions that we have to ask about in terms of like causation. Is something a sufficient factor, and before that is something necessary? There could be a necessary factor, but it does not sufficiently explain why something happened. And so option number one, if you said slavery, would be what do you think? And by the way, there is a New York Times supported sort of indoctrination, it's not even really accepted by any historians, that argues that the Civil War was caused because black slaves first showed up. And what year was that? (1619) is called the 1619 Project. It's really not very good in terms of history, but there are many who say, look, once black slaves showed up in America, the Civil War was bound to happen. Do you think I'm going to be making that argument? Okay, another possible option is with the creation of the American Constitution, while recognizing officially that slavery has a right to exist in the Union, but not being a national issue, rather being a sectional issue, right there, the causes of the Civil War are there both necessary and sufficient. At some point on down the line, there will be a Civil War because of that, because it's in the Constitution. How many of you think I'm going to be arguing that argument? I'll give you the third one, and then I'll let you make up your mind. The third one says something along the lines of the civil, and yes, it's necessary that black slaves were to have arrived in America. And yes, it is necessary that the Constitution would have slavery involved, but that's not sufficient. This is the cause of the Civil War. Slavery paired with westward expansion causes sectional divisions to become even more obvious, and a heightened sense of disgust with the other side leads to the American Civil War. In other words, slavery paired with Western expansion causes the Civil War. That's the third general option that historians tend to argue. How many of you think I'm going to be making that argument? Okay, I see the vast majority of you are saying yes, and you are right. So I'm sharing my screen with you now, or almost now. Okay. So here's my my argument. My thesis is going to be it's the expansion of slavery, which drives a wedge between North and South. And the expansion of slavery makes this wedge something that's not really fixable by what is typically used to fix problems in America, and that's called compromise. We're going to try compromising, but the expansion of slavery is just going to be too much that we can overcome with a compromise or two or five or as many as you want to dream up. It's not going to fix the problem. So this is going to be my argument. Now let me see if I can convince you of it. Which, by the way, is kind of what you're supposed to do when you write a DBQ or a long essay. You have an argument and you try to convince your reader that you are right. Okay. So the United States, and lots of the stuff we're going to go pretty quickly over because we've already talked about it in some detail. But the United States begins expanding and has this dream of moving across the continent. Louisiana Purchase almost doubles the size of land that the United States owned. And we go about getting even more land from there, as we've already mentioned. Let's look, though, at slavery, specifically in expansion. In 1820, we have Missouri, if you remember, wanting to come in as a slave state. And if you look at the amount of land that America owned at the time, well, you see Louisiana down there. We still, if you see the line here in Louisiana that kind of zigzags over, and you draw that Missouri Compromise line on over, this is the only area that can possibly become a slave if the Missouri Compromise is adhered to. In other words, slavery could go to Arkansas and maybe Oklahoma, but that's about it, right? The expansion of slavery is severely limited. And many Northerners are able to say, well, because it's limited, we will continue to put up with slavery in the South. But you can see by 1845, Missouri there is now slave, and Arkansas is now slave. But does anyone remember what happens in 1845? That really changes the look of the map. What comes in? Okay, I think I'm seeing a couple of you mouth it. It's Texas, right? Remember, Texas wins their independence in 35. 10 years later, we bring Texas into the United States. That's which basically shuts off relationship with Mexico. Good relationship stops at that point. And then what president basically picks a fight with the Mexicans so we can go to war with them? Yes, I see some of you mouthing his name. His name was James K. Polk. Good. And so now all of a sudden, though, because Texans already had slaves, it looks like slavery is what? It's expanding, but that's not the main issue. The main issue we'll talk about here in just a second. But to look at the expansion of slavery over the course of the years, see 1820, 1845, and 1860, slavery is making the march westward. And people in the North don't like it. People in the South do like it. And they do like it not just because they're a fan of slavery, and that's not even really the main issue. The main issue is that slavery is the main piece when it comes to their economy and their society. A Northerner in 1893 developed an invention called the cotton gin, which made slavery pay. And slavery continued to be important and grew more important in the South because of the cotton gin. What was that guy's name? Someone tell me.
Eli Whitney.
Yeah, that's right. Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. And so the sectional division grows, and this is for multiple reasons, but at base, it is economic. The North has, by the early 1800s, gotten rid of slavery. In the far north in Massachusetts, it hasn't been around for long before the Constitution. In the South, slavery has become more of a guarded institution as owning slaves becomes more profitable because of the growing of cotton. The North is growing their cities. To go along with the cities, they have educational institutions that are popping up. And also, you have to remember that during the 1830s, things like the Second Great Awakening, and with the Second Great Awakening, Transcendentalism, Romanticism, you have this sort of birth of abolitionism. It's been there, but it really takes off during this time as well. That's the North. In the South, on the other hand, settlements are more spread apart and disparate. It is largely an agricultural society. There isn't much manufacturing that is going on. And the population, in terms of which area has more population, the North has by far more people than the South does. And the South is able to maintain its sort of equal representation, not in the body of representatives that is based on population, but rather the one based on statehood, right? And that, of course, is the, see some of you mouthing it, the Senate, right? The Senate, every state has 2 senators, And so the South, if they can keep an equal number of, you know, kind of pro-Southern, and by the way, slavery is the key here, right? If you are a slave state, that is very definitive of your economy and also very definitive of your culture. Once you have a state come in that is not slave state, but is a free state, it's going to have a very different economy and culture. And so if you let too many free states come in, the slave states feel like they're going to lose their equal representation in the one body in the government that they actually have equal representation in, and that's the Senate. And so anytime a state comes in, it makes, well, everyone a little nervous. Okay, you may or may not realize this, but our government has relied upon compromise to function since its inception. Americans like to think of themselves as uncompromising, but that's just not true. Our entire system is based on compromise. Key compromises around territories and new states in order to keep a balance of power in the Senate becomes key, and the Missouri Compromise is a very clear indication of how important this is. By the way, does anybody remember who the main author of the Missouri Compromise was? A senator from the great state of Kentucky. Anyone know who that was? He's a guy who ran for president 3 times and lost. One of the, yeah, I see a couple of you mouthing his name, Henry Clay. Henry Clay is the guy, and he's going to be still around for the compromise coming in 1850, but it's not going to go as swimmingly, I'm afraid, as the Missouri Compromise. If you want to say that anything like that is swimming. Okay, the Missouri Compromise is designed to settle the issue of the spread of slavery forever. And if you look at the map, that makes sense given the reality. Because if you draw the Missouri Compromise line over, where can slavery possibly go? If you abide by it very strictly. What are the 2 states where slavery could go? Arkansas and Oklahoma minus the handle, right? In other words, the Northerners are able to plug their nose, but deal with it and say, well, at least slavery is contained, right? It can't go very far because Mexico, or Spain and then Mexico, owns all that land to the west. So we're fine. Like we're going to have this thing figured out. But as we'll see, that's not the case. I'm going to be talking not just about the expansion of slavery here, but also the fact that these 2 societies, North and South, are quite different. And the fact that while the North grows more strongly abolitionist during the first 60 years of the 1800s, the South grows much more closed to the idea of abolition. There was talk of abolition in the time of Jefferson. When Jefferson let his own half-black children, that might sound kind of strange, but he likely had children with Sally Hemings. The only slaves that Jefferson ever freed were her children, and they were remarkably white. You figure it out. But he let them free and gave them a little piece of woods back in the middle of nowhere where they wouldn't be bothered. Eventually, though, the South makes it illegal to free slaves. Why? Why do you think they'd make it illegal? So you couldn't even free your own slaves. Because it might make the people who were still in bondage begin to agitate for their freedom too. Now, Southerners had a narrative that they told themselves. They said this, and this is going to sound terrible, but this is the narrative that they told themselves. Black slaves are basically like children. If you treat a child well, the child will respect you. If you treat a child badly, they may rebel. Okay? And so that was the narrative that the South told themselves. And then something happened. In 1831, a guy named Nat Turner, who was actually a very well-treated, I mean, if you can be well-treated as a slave, he was well-treated as a slave. He was given a great deal of freedom to read and to pursue knowledge and to make experiments. The guy was considered a bit of a genius, and the black slaves that he lived with considered him to almost be a prophet. And he came up with this idea that he would get slaves together and throw off white rule. In other words, he was going to set the slaves free, and he was a slave. And so we got some of his friends at his plantation when some of the men were away to basically band together, and they went to their house and they killed the whole family that owned them. And then the whole white family. And then they marched to the neighbors' houses and started killing all of them too. And he talks about in his autobiography, which is really interesting, about when he was going to die. There was being put to death, right, for enacting a slave revolt. Nat Turner gave his opinion. He's like, yeah, so me and my friend Hark and Bob, I don't know what, we went to the door and we knocked on it, and the lady came out, and so we killed her with an axe. And then we went in and we killed her son. And then we went down the road and we realized, oh, there was an infant who lived there too. So we went back and Hark killed the infant. And so you read it and you're like, oh my goodness. And normally I read a portion of the autobiography to you because you can kind of hear how like startling it is. Oh my goodness, what is going on here? And so what Nat Turner's revolt showed the white South was that their narrative was wrong. In other words, what they believed about treating slaves well, not giving them any problems, wasn't necessarily true. And so the South began to clamp down more and more on any talk anywhere of abolition. The idea was that if slaves heard the word abolitionism or had the concept of abolition, then more things like what Nat Turner did might start happening. And so the North became more and more abolitionist. The South became a more and more closed society, closed to these ideas. And I'll give you an example from my family. My family, I had a great something or other grandmother on the Cook side that was Quaker. They were Quakers, and they lived, I believe, in either South Carolina or North Carolina. And they were down there, as they were everywhere, arguing against slavery. Quakers were the religious group that was probably most vocally opposed to slavery. And so my family were very opposed to slavery. And finally, as the laws kept landing where you just couldn't argue anymore against slavery, even legally, my family moved. They packed up and they moved to Indiana. That's just an illustration of how the South becomes more and more closed. We've already talked about the nullification crisis. The nullification crisis doesn't have anything to do specifically with slavery, but of course, it is an economic thing. And slavery is foundational to the economics of the South, being primarily agricultural and producing things that aren't even edible, like cotton, whereas the North, of course, is primarily industrial. But now we're getting to the crux of my argument. The crux of my argument has everything to do with the Mexican War. I think that if the Mexican War hadn't happened, and let's go back here really quickly to this map. Okay, so eventually, yeah, we make Arkansas state, but by the time the Mexican War rolls around, who's in Oklahoma? Do you remember? Where did the Trail of Tears end? Oklahoma. The Indians were there. So, I mean, really, where can slavery go? Arkansas, period, right? Now, don't worry, later we'll eventually take Oklahoma away from the Indians, kick them all out, and then divide it up for white people. But that's on down the line. At this point, the Indians are in Oklahoma. Okay, so moving on, we can see all this land that is given to the Americans after the end of the Mexican War. And this leads us to a major problem. And it's a problem that we can't ignore. Now, the North and the South like to argue about slavery. In fact, the Senate, I believe in 1836, and I think the House as well, introduced a new rule. And does anyone have any idea what the rule was that they released? I'll give you what it's called. It's called a gag rule. What's that? A gag rule was a rule about talking, making certain topics things you couldn't talk about. And so the gag rule basically said, beginning I think in 1836, in both houses of Congress, that the talk about slavery is banned. And you might say, well, that seems kind of odd. Yeah, it is a little bit odd because we supposedly have freedom of speech. But in order to get anything done rather than fight about slavery, they said, let's put the gag order in place so we can get other things done. Okay. After the Mexican War and we get all that land, guess what needs to be talked about again? You can't ignore, you can't gag it. The topic of slavery, right? And so the question with the Mexican War and the lands that we received at the end of the war is, how do we deal with slavery in the new lands? And then keep in mind that in 1848, we get to land 49, there's the gold rush, and in 1850, what's the problem? Like, talk about, you have to deal with the issue. California has enough people to come in as a state. And they want to. Can you ignore the slavery question anymore? You can't. Not only, and by the way, the gag rule had been violated when the Mexican War started. There was a guy from Pennsylvania, his name was David Wilmot, and he introduced the Wilmot Proviso to Congress, and of course it just goes, it blows up. The Wilmot Proviso basically said, because he wanted to jump on, like, if we're going to steal land from Mexico, let's make sure that we have the rules in place before we get it about slavery. And since he was Pennsylvania, what do you think was he for expanding slavery or not? What the proviso said was basically there would, like, any land gotten from Mexico, slavery will be automatically abolished. How well do you think that went over? Do you think it was ever passed? Put into law? Yeah, no. The South was not going to have any of that. And so already we knew there was this potential for a big conflict about slavery in these new lands, but it really comes to a head in 1850. In order to have California come in as a state, we have to figure out what to do with the slavery question. And so if you go back to the Missouri Compromise line, which was still in effect, like the Missouri Compromise had been put in effect in 1820 and it was still in effect. Draw the line on over, and what's the problem? What happens with California?
Part of California is underneath it.
Yeah, about half of California is underneath the Missouri Compromise. Now you might say, well, I know what the solution is. We cut California in half and have the North and the South come in as two separate states. Two problems with that. First is the issue that Southern California didn't want slavery. Like, no one there wanted it. It was a resounding no. Second problem, if you cut California in half, all of a sudden you don't have enough people to make it a state, right? You have to have California as a whole come in order to allow it to be a state. And so the question is, what do you do? How do you make a compromise so that California can come in and the South is somewhat happy and the North is somewhat happy? Well, guess who's still in the Senate, but a really old man at this point? Henry Clay. Remember, he came up with the Compromise of 1820. So he comes up and says, he proposes doing away with his old compromise and coming up with a new compromise. The only problem was every proposal he came up with floundered. But there was a young, bright senator from the great state of Illinois who had a solution to this problem, and his name was, some of you are saying Abraham Lincoln. I'm sorry, I set you up for that one really bad. That's not right. His name was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was the guy who came forward to put, I know that was mean, I'm sorry, that was my bad. Stephen Douglas comes forward to propose this compromise. And this compromise has 5 main elements. We're really going to look at 2 of those 5 main elements. Okay, so Compromise of 1850, Stephen Douglas and Henry Clay kind of put this together. And Stephen Douglas introduces a concept that you absolutely need to be familiar with as students. You guys need to be familiar with this concept. The concept is called popular sovereignty. If you don't know what that is, you need to write it down. Rather than the federal government deciding whether a state would be free or slave, popular sovereignty says that the people of the state will decide. So let them vote. Now, California has already voted, has already made itself known that it wishes to come in as a free state. Let's look at the map. So California, so in other words, we're taking out the Missouri Compromise line. We're throwing out the Missouri Compromise. Does the South like this? No, they don't like this at all. So in order to compromise with the South, you got to give them something. So California is going to come in. That means that the balance is going to be lopsided. But we're doing away with the line. This is what popular sovereignty says. Any state that comes in can decide for themselves whether they want to be slave or free. So this makes actually the North really uncomfortable, and for good reason. Because what could potentially happen now? See, slavery could spread not only to places like New Mexico and Arizona, but now slavery could what? You take out the whole line, and now all of a sudden slavery could go anywhere that there isn't already a state. And so Kansas and Nebraska, and I mean, imagine slavery in Montana potentially. Now, these aren't states yet. This is just a territory. But no matter how you draw the lines, at some point, these things could come in as slave states. So do abolitionists in the North love this compromise? No. Not only is slavery not contained anymore only to the South, but now slavery can go into the North too. And this makes some people very, very, very uncomfortable. Does that kind of all make sense? Okay. And so, and you might say, well, at least the compromise happened. And by the way, you also have to make the South happy as well. And so two things are done here really to make the South happy. The first one is, of course, the idea of doing away with the Missouri Compromise line. So potentially the South can have more power in the future. But also, you've got Southerners complaining about the fact that what they called their property, their slaves, would escape into the North, and then the Northerners would do what? Shield them. Southerners didn't like that. They said, hey, Northerners, you are being disrespectful to us by not returning our property. And so in order to get the South on board with this compromise, they also strengthened the fugitive slave law, which made it illegal for anyone in the North who comes in contact with a escaped slave not to turn them back to their master. And so this means that if there's going to be a slave escaping out of slavery, where do they have to go now? Can they just go up to, Michigan?
They have to go to Canada.
Yeah, they have to go all the way to Canada. And so you can see here the South likes this. The Northern abolitionists are like, wait, if I run into a slave on the street that's escaped, I am legally, required to turn him in. Yes, you are. I consider that to be morally wrong. I don't care. You have to turn him in. And that was the situation. You can see why people in the North would be very, very unhappy. And so what Quakers did was they helped to develop something they already had developed, was kind of this little escape route to the North to help slaves get free. But now they have to get the slaves all the way up to Canada in order for them to be free. And what's that little route called? I see a few of you mouthing it. Yeah, the Underground Railroad. And who was the kind of the former slave black conductor of this Underground Railroad? Does anyone remember her name? Her name was Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman.
And yeah, her nickname was Moses. Because just like Moses leads the children of Israel out of the bondage of Egypt, so too does Harriet Tubman, or Moses, lead black slaves out of their own slavery. And so these things are put in place as a compromise. Now, right here you might say, well, at least America gets to continue and we have this thing sort of figured out. It's a nice thought, I suppose, that America was able to kind of keep going. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't really work out. And it doesn't work out because people in Missouri want to see the value of their slaves go up, and they want to see their culture spread. And so when Kansas has enough people to come in as a state in 1854, they say we want to come in, but they have to decide, remember popular sovereignty, they have to vote. What are they going to be for your slave? So people from Missouri rush in with their guns to insist they come in as a slave state. Other people from the north rush in with their guns to insist they come in as a free state. And so you'd have one town voting, and then the other side rushing in and burning that town to the ground. You have one side writing a free constitution for the state of Kansas, and the other side rushing in and shooting people. You had, in essence, a mini civil war before the Civil War in Kansas. And so this popular sovereignty idea might have worked for a compromise in 1850, but by 1854, it seemed to already be a bit of a disaster. Okay, so once again, my argument has been the expansion of slavery westward, and the potential for the expansion of slavery westward drives this wedge between North and South even deeper and more irrevocably than had been before. And so I think this is the cause of the Civil War. That's the argument that I am making. And hopefully you can see how all these things, or most of these things, are pointing towards this challenge of slavery expanding to be a main piece here. In fact, when Abraham Lincoln ran for president, he said, I don't like slavery. I wish it would go away, but I'm not for the abolition of slavery. Abraham Lincoln said, I'm just for ceasing it from moving anywhere else. That was actually his position. We'll talk more about that later. Have a great weekend. If you have any questions, please stay on and ask me anything that you want to know. Otherwise, we'll see you on Tuesday. Once again, pay attention to the assignments that have landed in Google Classroom. And until then, we'll see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.